Well, again, good morning. Glad that you're here this morning as we continue in our worship, as we open ourselves to what God is saying to us through the Bible and through our story this morning, which is the continuation of the story of Esther. Now, for the past 3 weeks, including this week now 4, we've been spending in this book of Esther, which, as we talked about last week, is not a book that's preached on as much. It's not a book that you probably have done a lot of Bible studies on. You probably don't have a favorite memory verse or have heard a lot of memory verse kind of verses or passages from this book. And we talked about some of the reasons why last week. But as we move into the story, like we said last week, I don't assume that all of you have been here for every week, and so we want to do a quick recap of the story because the story is so important for our understanding of what we'll be talking about today. So, the book of Esther, you always have to put anything in the Bible in its cultural and historical context. The historical context here is the Babylonian kingdom. And the king of the Babylonians is King Xerxes. By the way, I rewatched last week the sermon because I like to go back and critique it. I didn't say Xerxes, I can't do it now, Xerxes correctly the entire sermon, okay? And I'll do it 10 other times a day. You've got this king who is a Babylonian king, and this king banished his wife. His wife's name is Vashti, and he banished Vashti from the kingdom. Vashti was a God-fearing woman and didn't do what the king wanted her to do. Then you have the introduction of this woman named Esther, who is the heroine of our story, and we also are introduced to her cousin / father figure, Mordecai. God ends up appearing to Esther and is calling Esther to intercede to the king on behalf of the Jewish people because God knows something bad is about to happen. So God appears to Esther and compels Esther to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. And so Esther goes and finds favor with the king. Later on in the story, we see that God actually appears to the king and begins to soften the king's heart to make Esther his queen. As we continue with the story, we have a real villain who appears, and the villain's name is Haman. And the Bible talks about the hardening of hearts, and Haman's heart became hardened, and Haman became just hungry for power. And when that happened, the faithful Mordecai steps in, and Haman says, everyone has to bow to me, but Mordecai says, no. In the 10 Commandments, it says, there is no other God before me. You shall bow to no other gods. And so Mordecai makes this incredibly devout religious stand in front of Haman. And Haman then decides he's not only going to kill Mordecai, but he's going to kill the people who worship the God that Mordecai refused to bow for, or because of. Well, as the story goes on, Esther springs into action. She basically strikes up a deal with the king. The king eventually says, yes, I will give you an IOU. Esther eventually cashes in the IOU. And not only is Mordecai not murdered, not only are the Jews not exterminated, but Haman gets his on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. And then the story ends with the entire Babylonian Empire under the king Xerxes, that's pretty close, under the king, because the king had seen the power of the God of the Jews, and the entire Babylonian Empire begins to worship the God of Israel. How many of you remember that story from last week? I remember some of it. Here's the problem. That's not the story. You might say, well, no, you mispronounced that king's name like 15 times last week. I'm certain he was in the story. And you'd be right about that. You'd also be right that Esther and Mordecai and Haman were all in that story. You'd be right about the general arch of the story, that there was this woman who became a queen who wasn't before, who then found out a plot to exterminate the Jews that were living in Babylon, that she gained favor in the eyes of the king, that Haman got his, and Mordecai and Esther were lifted up. But here's the problem with the retelling of the story. God was not present at all in the actual story. I don't know if you heard, but I kept talking about how God interceded here and God inspired and called here, and that God hardened hearts and softened hearts. Here's the thing. Here's the most unique thing about the book of Esther. God is not in the book of Esther. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. God does not speak in the book of Esther. Go back and read the whole thing. It's not there. There's only one other book in the Old Testament that's even slightly comparable to this, and it's the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, God doesn't speak, but God is spoken about and worshiped in the book of Ruth. So God is in the book of Ruth, God just doesn't speak. Every other book in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, God both speaks and is talked about, not the book of Esther. Ruth, God wasn't speaking, but they were good Jews. Esther, not a very good Jew. Not a very good Jew. Now, don't take my word for it as a 21st century white Protestant middle-aged man. Ask the early church fathers. The book of Esther was incredibly controversial when they were building the canon. If you're not familiar with the canonization process, the Bible didn't just appear on the ground on stone or clay tablets from God. A group of people, almost all men, had to bring books together and decide whether they were going to be a part of the Bible, both the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament, and the New Testament. There were groups of people who got together, scholars, theologians, practitioners who came together to decide whether a book would be able to be in the Bible or not. During the canonization process, this book of Esther was the most debated book, both in the canonization of the Old Testament and the canonization of the New Testament. In regards to the Old Testament, when the Jews were putting together the canon, a couple things. One, a couple strikes against it. One, it was not in the Dead Sea Scroll library. If you'll remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls came from these caves that were found in the late 40s. And there were tons and tons and tons and tons of scrolls that were found in there. And they were the scrolls, both the religious books as well as the kind of practical books of this sect that lived on the banks of the Dead Sea in a very harsh climate called the Essenes. These were their documents and is the best preserved library of ancient documents, ancient biblical documents especially, that we have. Every other book in the Old Testament was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Guess which one was not? The book of Esther. Not only was it not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Purim, which is a Jewish feast, a Jewish holiday that celebrates the Jews' deliverance as we find it in the book of Esther, the salvation of the Jews, Purim was not celebrated by the Essenes of the Dead Sea community. So you got two strikes against it right there. Now, we talked about Purim, how it's connected with the salvation of the Jews, the deliverance, the rescue of the Jews, as we find it in the book of Esther. Well, guess what? Purim and Esther were not always connected. After Esther was finally canonized, then it was connected with the feast of Purim. So Esther wasn't even connected originally with the feast that we know it best for. It also was not included in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is incredibly important to Judaism because that's where you find all the rabbinic teachings, all the early rabbinic teachings on the book. It's like a giant commentary, and they didn't touch it in the Babylonian Talmud. So, for Jews, Esther was a very controversial book. One more reason. The king, who I can't pronounce his name is said 190 times in the 10 chapters of Esther. And the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, 0. Now, don't think that this is just a Jewish issue. Christians did the same thing. Now, when we talk about early Christianity, we got to talk about two camps. One is Western Christianity, the other is Eastern Christianity. Western Christianity, up until about 1055, is represented by the Catholic Church. Eastern Christianity at 1055 is represented by the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, right? So you got these two camps of Christianity. Western Christianity, think Roman Catholic and the vein that Methodists ended up coming from, right? They were okay with Esther. It was in the canon, but here's the interesting thing. A commentary was never even written about the book of Esther until the year 836. 800 years after Jesus died was the first time a commentary was even written about the book of Esther. So while it was in the Western canon, the Roman Catholic canon, it wasn't a celebrated book at all. You swing over to the Orthodox Church, they did not want to include it. It was there was much debate. They didn't want to include it. Finally, some of the early church fathers around the 300s-400s started to kind of petition for it to be included in the canon. So this is a book that is wildly controversial, and we understand why. The name of God is never said, and the voice of God is never heard. If we want to put it in another way, the book of Esther is a completely secular book that's located in our religious holy text. So you understand why it was problematic. You might be sitting there thinking, why am I sitting here listening to a sermon on it? In fact, why have I listened to 4 weeks of sermons on it? Well, let me tell you. I want to argue for you today that the book of Esther might be, and I might even say is, the most relatable book in the entire Hebrew Bible for you and I today. The book of Esther is the most relatable book in the Hebrew Bible for you and I today. And here's why I think that. The first one is that God is not audibly giving direction in the book of Esther. Every other book in the Bible, every other book in the Old Testament especially, God is giving direction to the people of that book. Had a youth a number of years ago, 20 years ago, a kid named Jeffrey. Jeffrey came up to me one day and he said, hey, can we talk? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And so he said, maybe let's just meet like Monday night and talk. I said, okay. So we get together, we're talking. He said, hey, I just don't think God hears me. I said, what do you mean God doesn't hear you? He said, well, maybe I should rephrase that. I don't hear God. I said, why? He said, well, I hear you talk all the time. You get up every week and you talk about how you feel like God's leading you in this direction or how you felt like you heard this from God. And he said, I've never heard God. He said, I've never heard God audibly. He said, I've never heard God like push me in a direction. I've never heard God. And in that moment, I realized how irresponsible I had been with my language. When I would stand up and say, I felt God, I hear God, I was not being completely honest when I say I heard God call me this way. because I'd never audibly heard God, and I would argue you probably haven't audibly heard God either. And so for that reason, the book of Esther is incredibly relevant to us because she didn't hear God either. God didn't audibly say, Esther, go and do this. Esther, I want you to save my people. Esther, I will show you a way and provide you a way. All throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we see that. From the very beginning, Adam and Eve, not only did they hear God, it said God walked with them in the cool of the evening. We look at Moses. God hasn't been doing anything on the scene for a long time. Then all of a sudden, God appears to Moses in a bush that is burning but is not consumed by fire. God is delivering these miracles, and Moses is consistently hearing the voice of God. We look at the prophets in the Old Testament, and consistently, they are not only audibly present, the voice of God is not only audibly present to them, but God is moving in very real and tangible ways that they could very easily point to. But not Esther. And I would argue, not us. So I think Esther is incredibly relevant to us today as we think about the audible voice of God, or maybe the lack of the audible voice of God. The second reason why I think Esther is so important to us today is because Esther was forced to make difficult decisions with no clear mandate on what to do and what is right. You see, Esther didn't have a clear direction from God, but she found herself in obviously murky ethical territory. The entire book is full of these ethical conundrums, these ethical quagmires that forced this woman who was already in a bad place. She was in this autocracy. She was a woman, so she was seen as second rate in every sense of the word. She was already in a bad place, but then she's forced into a situation where there is no clear right, but there's a heck of a lot of really questionable wrongs. I would argue that that's the exact place we find ourselves in. If we open our eyes and open our ears to the modern world around us, there's very little black and white. There's a heck of a lot of gray, though. There's very few times where there is one clear, direct path to what is right and to what is good. But there's a lot of paths that could be or could not be the right way to go. We find ourselves in these positions with our families, with our jobs, as we participate in the work of government and politics. We find ourselves consistently, if we open our eyes and open our ears and refuse to accept the certainties of black and white, we will see that we live in a world that is full of gray. I think this is one of the reasons why Christianity, so many people who want to follow Jesus and who want to live in the rule and the way of Christianity will opt towards fundamentalism. Because fundamentalism will stand here and tell you, here is the exact right way, here is the exact wrong way, and there is no gray in between. It's a lot easier. If you just have some guy, usually by the way, some guy stand up here and say, you do this, you don't do this, go about your merry way, and don't forget to tithe. It's easier. But argue, one, it's not biblical. Two, it's not God-honoring. And three, it's just not truthful. Because the world we live in has a lot of questions. And oftentimes not a lot of clear answers. All you have to do is open up a newspaper or look in your news feed. There's a war raging right now in Israel. And some people will stand from pulpits and tell you, you support Israel unequivocally. You don't question it. That is what you do. There are other pulpits that will say, Israel is evil. They're bombing. They're doing this. It's horrible. And there will be places that will tell you it's either this or that. But if we open our eyes and we look and we think about it, not in these black and white definitives, but if we look and say, yeah, there's systemic injustice that has happened to the Palestinian people for decades. And there are hundreds of completely innocent Jews attending music festivals and living their lives who were slaughtered. And there is a disproportionate amount of force that's being used in Gaza. And this was an unprovoked attack. And of the 2 million people living in that tiny strip of land we call the Gaza Strip, half of them are under 18 years old. It's not black and white. We live in the world of Esther, where it's a quagmire of questionable, murky, ethical decisions. And we have the choice. Do we look at it through black and white lenses, or do we open up our world to Technicolor? Thirdly, Esther was faced with the temptation to put her head down and leave well enough alone. And I think that's a temptation that you and I have every single day. See, she had finally reached a place of acceptability. She didn't have to worry where her next meal was going to come from. She was accepted. She was the queen. She was not only accepted, but she was revered and envied. She had found a place of comfort. She didn't have to worry where she was going to sleep. She didn't have to worry if she were going to be protected, which means she found a place of safety. She was the queen of the most powerful man in the empire. When she got into that position of privilege, she could have put her head down, left well enough alone, and pretended that the problems of the rest of the world were just too far out of her reach. But she didn't. She chose not only to hide, to not hide within her privilege, she chose to use her privilege to affect the world that wasn't necessarily directly affecting her. When we have enough and more than enough, this is one of our greatest temptations, is to duck our head and leave well enough alone. So like I said, I think Esther is one of the most relatable books for us today. It's the most secular book that we see in the entire Bible. It's a book where God doesn't directly speak and God is never directly named, where religious practice is in no way involved in the book. But here's the hope that I want to inject into this conversation of parallel worlds. Just like Amanda said earlier in the children's moment, just because we cannot see, feel, hear, or understand God, that does not mean that God is not at work. Just because we cannot see, feel, hear, or understand what God is doing doesn't mean that God's not there. We have to. So that's the first lesson I want us to learn, is that God is there even if, like my youth from 20 years ago, Jeffrey couldn't hear God. He later came to the conclusion that God was at work even if he couldn't hear God. The second lesson I want us to learn from the book of Esther is that Esther did the next right thing. She just did the next right thing. Even if it wasn't clear, she said, here are my options. I've got to do something. So I'm going to trust and do the next right thing. She didn't ask the question 10 questions down the road. She said, what's the next right thing to do? The third thing that I think that we can learn from Esther is that we cannot be afraid of hard choices and the grittiness of ethics and seeing the world in full color. Do you remember the movie from several years ago, probably 20-something years ago, maybe 30, Pleasantville? Do you remember that movie? It had like Tobey Maguire and a young Reese Witherspoon and Jeff Daniels. And the movie, you turn on the movie and the movie's black and white. It looks like an old 1950s movie. And then grittiness and ethics and questions and not the black and white world they were living in began to invade, and it invaded in the form of color. And so slowly, the characters started to see color. And it didn't, and here's the thing, Pleasantville was easy. All the boys on the basketball team made all the three-point shots, right? All the women were beautiful, all the men were smart and happy, and the world was easy. But then the grittiness started to invade, and by the end of the movie, the entire movie is in color. It's this beautiful progression. That is the world, those are the worlds that we have the choice to live in. Is it black and white and easy, or is it color and gritty and real? We don't have to be afraid of the hard choices and the grittiness of ethics. If we're being honest about Esther, we have to admit she's not a very good religious person. She's not someone that we're going to ask to come teach children's Sunday school. But because of her faithfulness to the good, doing the right thing, her choice to live in the tension and ambiguity of the world that she was living in and not to shy away from it, her choices to make the sacrifices for the greater good and align herself with ideals that are greater than herself, she's not a good religious person. But her praises have been sung about her name and her story for thousands and thousands of years. May we be good Esthers today. Let's pray.